reviewed, for instance, reviewed by more quantitative scholars, that you don't do random sampling. You do theoretical sampling. And actually, sampling is ongoing in time. So as you proceed with your research, and as to the extent that you start understanding what might be going on, you deliberately pick your next point of entry to the field. And that may be another organization, it may be another, informant within the same organization. Many different things are possible. So it's theoretical sampling, and then the idea is that you continue with this whole process until you have a theory that is sufficiently rich, plausible, and consistent, which we call saturation. The next one, please. Now, a very important thing is that grounded theory is based on the principle of coding. And coding is a particular approach to doing qualitative research, which is not, embraced by all qualitative researchers. Code is a word or a phrase that you use to identify a chunk of data. That can be, a part of a transcript of an interview, but it can also be an observation. It could be many different things. Any type of qualitative data. Next one, yeah. So now, in some approaches using coding, there is the illusion that coding can be like almost an automatic process. If you do it in a very automatic way, then it would be objective. Now, but that is not true, because the decision to code a particular chunk of data in itself already is an act of interpretation. And so why, is this particular part of the interview interesting and the next part is not? That is already based on an interpretation of what it could mean and how it could function ultimately in your theory. So it's never mechanical. It cannot be, and it should not be. And it also reflects the research question, if you have one. I suppose in most cases you do have one. And the theoretical perspective. Now, in classical grounded theory, to be honest, this idea of a theoretical perspective was frowned upon. You shouldn't start with a particular theoretical perspective. Nowadays, we understand that that is actually impossible. And you always, if not explicitly, then at least implicitly have some theoretical perspective, which will guide your expectations. But one important thing to keep in mind is that coding is a fracturation of the data. You chop the data into little pieces. And this is completely different from what we will see in classic case studies, where there is a much more holistic approach. And so there, normally, you will not have a practice like coding. And you will try to interpret the case and understand the case in its entirety. Not cutting up the data in little chunks. The next one, please, Louisa. Now, there are a number of different steps in this process. As I already said, if you do pure classical grounded theory, you will not have a theory to start with. You will not have any theoretical concepts guiding your research. So what you do then is open coding. And so the codes emerge from the data, so they're not existing. The opposite approach would be that you have particular concepts and you try to recognize those in your data. So, for instance, you would have a concept like organizational identification, and you would look in your data for all the instances where things that respondents say point at some level or form of organizational identification. In classical grounded theory, it's the opposite. There is no concept to start with. The concepts emerge from the data. So open coding, so then you have a number of concepts. Then you start with comparing those, actual coding, make relationship between them. Maybe you can collapse some codes. Or maybe you can split up codes, or you can juxtapose codes. This is the opposite of that, or this leads to that. And so you start making connections. And then the final step would be theoretical, or sometimes called selective coding, where you say, okay, what is the core theme of my investigation? What is the phenomenon that I really want to understand and explain? And then you start systematically linking all the other codes that you have created to that core theme. So maybe the next slide, Louisa. So here's an example from my own work, an older paper where we were interested in consensus at the interface between the business interface between Japanese and Dutch firms. So obviously, and this was done very much in a classical grounded theory way. So ultimately the core theme were the attributes of consensus, which differed between the Japanese and the Dutch. And then we said, okay, what are in the views of those informants antecedents of consensus? And are they the same for Dutch respondents as for Japanese respondents? And what are the consequences of consensus? So what you very often see in this type of research is that this is a kind of an organizing mechanism. You have this central theme, which is the center of your attention. What is causing it and what is caused by it? That is, but it could also be different. But this is something you see a lot. Next one, please. So now there has been a lot of criticism of classical grounded theory, and I think with good reasons. So we will see it lives on very much. I think many qualitative researchers nowadays call themselves grounded theory researchers, but they do things in different ways. So one very obvious criticism is that the original idea of Glaser and Strauss, that their observations would be theory-free, is simply untenable. That is not possible. We are not capable of observing the world without somehow, being guided by expectations. And the expectations, of course, are formed by our theories, implicit or explicit. And so it's also, it's a bit naive. This would be pure induction. And pure induction, I think, is simply impossible. Now, another thing is, if you look at especially the early formulations of grounded theory, the idea was that you are completely free in where you go, what will be the next step in your research, where will you go now? So that suggests complete freedom of choice in selecting your informants, selecting the organizations where you will do research, etc. Well, of course, that is not the reality for most of us. We have restrictions. So in many cases, you have to, agree beforehand with an organization how many interviews you will do, who will be interviewed, who not, etc. And you have limited time. So we cannot simply afford to go on and on and on with our research until we have some form of saturation. Mostly we have a fixed time available, fixed period of time available, and then it needs to be finished. So that is also something that really is not very realistic anymore. Finally, no, not finally, but the next point is that there was also something strange going on in the idea of Glaser and Strauss, that the theory, it is the discovery of grounded theory. So the theory somehow was expected to be already out there in the field. And that is also an idea that, of course, does not resonate very much nowadays. So the theory is in our minds, not in the fields. The theory is something in our minds that helps us to make sense of what we see in the real world. So we should really see that as social constructions and not as something that is inherent to reality. And then some maybe minor things. Very often, at least in the past, the phrase grounded theory was used as a kind of an excuse to, I'm not going to discuss the literature. I'm just going in, the field with a blank sheet, but you cannot ignore the literature. That's impossible. So it doesn't work. A lot of research would then simply replicate what has been done already. What are you doing? Yeah. And sometimes also, and that is also something that really doesn't work. It's a routine technique. Yeah? So it's just a kind of a cookbook method. If you follow the steps, you will have good research. But as I said, the core of grounded theory is coding. And coding is not and can never be a mechanical routine procedure. Yeah? It always implies that you are interpreting what you are seeing. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to code. Okay, the next one, please. Okay, so that's classical grounded theory. Now, classic case studies, and we will see this is really something quite different. So this is a research method that involves investigating one or a small number of social entities or situations about which data are collected using multiple sources of data. I think that is an important part. And developing a holistic description through an iterative research process. So there are some similarities. This iteration, you go from the field, from the data collection to your interpretation, to your theorizing, back to the field, etc. So that is something which is very different from the procedures in quantitative research, where you're supposed to have your hypothesis ready before you go into the field. Of course, we all know that it's not always the case. But at least that is the ideal we want to live up to. Now, that is not the case in qualitative research and not the case in classic case studies either. So, typical is that you have many variables. You may have only one case, but a lot of things are going on. So, from a statistical or mathematical point of view, that wouldn't make sense. So you would need many more cases than variables. But in case study research, the idea is you can have many variables and just one or just a few cases. Next one, please. So, and the reason is that we are interested in a configuration of variables. It's not like measuring variables isolated from one another. It's the whole set of variables together, or factors, if you want to avoid the word variables, that helps us understand what is going on in a case. And so there is really, I think, a great contrast between case studies and grounded theory. So case studies typically don't use coding. If you want to write a case study, you are interested in the story as a whole. And that is very different from, cutting up the data in small parts and making comparisons between those data chunks and connecting those data chunks. So it's a very different way. So if you use interviews to write a case study, you will do that in a different way than when you use case studies to do grounded theory. So case studies are particularly fit for exploring how and why types of questions. That means that you would spell out or uncover mechanisms or change of causality. Something happens because something else happened before. And we know that causality is particularly difficult to establish, also in quantitative research. So a lot of quantitative research is of a correlational nature, actually, rather than being able to establish causality. Now, of course, case studies, being just a study of one or a few cases, can also never give certainty about causality, cause-effect relations, but they can uncover the mechanisms that link cause and effect. And in that sense, make it more plausible that there is indeed a causal relationship than when we would just have data, a data point before and a data point after, and we don't know what connects these two. So that's the how question. And the other one is the why question. That is case studies can also be used to understand why actors in a particular situation, let's say an organization that was in a situation of crisis, why they acted in a particular way. What do the actors think they are up to borrow the phrase from Clifford Geertz. Okay, next one, please. Yeah, so now I will move to the present day methods. These two, Gioia method, which is strongly rooted in grounded theory, and the Eisenhardt method, which is a more, we could say, a contemporary form of case studies. In the case of Eisenhardt, always multiple cases. Starting with Gioia. Next one, yeah. Yeah, so Gioia very clearly is a present-day version of grounded theorizing, using coding typically. But what is very specific to this particular way of doing qualitative research is the emphasis on the transparency with regard to the trail of evidence. So very important, and actually, according to Gioia himself, and I think I agree, the strong point of this method is that you actually can show the readers how you came from your, let's say, your observations or interviews to your theoretical concepts. So the method is particularly used to understand how actors create interpretations of organizational reality and act on these interpretations. So Gioia says, you know, I will bend backwards to try to understand the phenomenon that I'm studying in the using the concepts and the language of the actors living in that reality. And so trying basically to look from the perspective of people in the field, and then make the next step and say, okay, how can I as a researcher understand that? It is mostly used in an abductive way, so not pure induction. So normally you will start with some theoretical concepts, but in the course of this of the research, you may you know, unearth new emerging themes or concepts, or you may split up concepts into subcategories, etc. So next one, please. So now one back. So there's something very similar going on as what we saw with Glaser and Strauss. Also, again, 3 steps in the coding process. You start with what Gioia calls first order codes, which are basically chunks of raw data. What are interesting relevance observations? And you put a label to it. In the case of Gioia, if possible, a label expressed in the language of the informant. Then the second step would be trying to, you know, make relationships between these concepts, these emerging concepts. So, you know, they can be, you know, brought together. They are particular instances of the same general theme, or they can be different, or they can have cause-effect relations, etc., etc. And then ultimately, you order them in what he calls third order themes or dimensions, which are the main building blocks of your theory. Now, if you go to the next slide, this is an example. Back on. This is an example of a paper where we looked at how managers try to influence the interpretations of employees during the post-merger integration process, sense giving. And we said, okay, looking at what we see in the data. So we started with sense giving. We knew that we wanted to study sense giving, but actually going through the data, we found that there were very different things going on. Sometimes management really wanted to silence particular interpretations, what we call sense breaking. Or sense hiding, actually. That sense breaking was given it another meaning to what people actually said. And sense specification is, okay, yes, what you say is going on, but we give it a slightly different meaning. So different forms of sense giving were one of the things. And then sense giving was one of the main building blocks of the theory that we made based on those observations. But what we see here is very typical of the Gioia methods, the data structure. So the data structure really is the core of this particular methods. And the strength of this is that it allows you to see how particular dimensions and concepts are rooted in the data. So on the left-hand side, in the ideal case, there are concrete observations or quotes from interviews. The more concrete, the better. And then on the right-hand side, the more you go to the right hand, the more theoretical it becomes. But it gives an overview very clearly of how you came to your conclusions ultimately. Next one, please. So one back. There are some concerns, like with every method, also about the Gioia methods. So some people think it's a bit naive to think that what participants say and do in social settings, what you base your research on, that it actually gives you insight in their authentic inner worlds. And they might manipulate you. And to a certain extent, that of course is true. So it's not beyond criticism. Some people say, well, this is abduction, so you always start already with some theoretical concept. So what are the chances of you finding really something new? I would say maybe, okay, but what are the chances that any of us in our academic career find something really new? Most of us, work in the further development of theories, the refinement of theories. And there are only few researchers who really come up with something new. So I don't think that is a very serious problem. The third bullet point maybe is, and here we also find the big difference between someone like Gioia and someone like Eisenhardt. So Eisenhardt would be skeptical about the possibility of really developing theory based on a single case. She would say, well, only if I can compare and contrast cases, that will give me a solid empirical basis for developing a theory. And the next one is actually, I think, also a serious one, especially since the Gioia method is quite often nowadays applied as some kind of cookbook methods. If you follow the steps, you will get, a publishable paper. But there is one big problem. Gioia has never made clear, and probably cannot make clear, how you come from, this more or less mechanical or routine process of, going through the data and, going from raw data in a couple of steps to theoretical dimensions. How to find novelty, how to make it interesting. That is not something that is self-evident. So there you can do a lot of research, you can do all the work, and come up just with dull generalizations. And then the final point, nowadays there's quite some pushback from reviewers, from journals who say, well, this is I've seen so many papers that try to apply this Gioia methods in a mechanical way. Can't you think of something else? So it should not be something that becomes very uninspired and routine. Next one, please. Okay, and then finally the Eisenhardt methods, which is in many ways contrasting with the Gioia methods. This is here. Whereas in Gioia the idea was, we want to basically understand the reality, the socially constructed reality from the perspective of people in the field. Here, the idea is, no, I want to understand objective reality. Not so much, the lived reality or the perspectives of participants. Mm-hmm. So a different way of looking at it. So the justification of this type of research typically is that it's phenomenon-based. I see an interesting phenomenon, but we do not have a satisfactory theory. That is, if you look at Eisenhardt's work and people following this method, this is typically how it starts. we see a particular phenomenon we don't understand. Like, for instance, we know a lot about, once there is a particular social network with a particular structure, we know that structure leads to, giving more opportunities to some players and fewer to others. But how does the structure come about? So that type of question could be asked. Typically, well, multiple cases. She says it really starts with 4 cases, and above 10, it becomes problematic. So between 4 and 10 cases, but as I will show later, sometimes, you can have cases within cases. And I'll show an example again from my own work where we had 8 cases within one particular post-merger integration process. So it can be cases within case, or sometimes your opportunities to use the Eisenhardt methods are maybe bigger than you think if you think of only one case. No, maybe you have multiple cases within that case. And in this research, the common dimensions across cases are emphasized. Whereas in the Gioia method, it's more about the uniqueness of the case that is emphasized. Yeah, the next one, please. So here also, again, theoretical sampling. In that sense, it looks a bit like a grounded theory. By the way, Katie Eisenhardt calls herself a grounded theorist. So although she doesn't follow those standards. So in this case, in Eisenhardt's case, it would typically be a selection of cases at the start of the research. And she, on the previous slide, I've given some, titles of papers where she describes her method. And she typically starts with, a number of firms in a particular industry at a particular point in time, and then compares how they are doing and what are they doing differently that leads to these different results. So it could be interviews, but it could also be others. Katie Eisenhardt is very much into, collecting any type of data you can, including quantitative data. The interviews will be very different from those in a Gioia approach, where it's more like, why did you do particular things? What was your motivation to do so? What was your impression? What were your perceptions? Maybe even what were your emotions? Eisenhardt was more, what was happening? When? Who did what? Courtroom style questioning, trying to find the objective truth. And again, data collection and data analysis, like in the other approaches, typically overlap. The next one, please. So the first step would be normally to write a case narrative. So understand each of the cases that you study as a whole. So this would be a bit like the classical case method. But it's just the first step, because the real beef is in the cross-case comparison. So the within-case narrative very often will not even be in the final paper, because they take too much space. So you will maybe summarize the cases in a table or something, but the narratives you use, it's a step that is necessary for yourself to have full understanding of what happens within the cases before you start comparing them. And there's the real, I would say, core of this method. How can you compare these cases? And she gives a number of tips on how you could do that. You could have different categories, small firms, big firms, and then say, okay, how do the small firms differ from the big firms? How are they similar to each other? That type of thing. Pairwise comparison, where you have, the most extreme cases, maybe polar cases. Also, sometimes comparison of different types of data. I have maybe data on market shares, and I have data on, how companies think they have performed. Do they point in the same direction? We have well-performing firms according to management, and we have well-performing firms in terms of their sales figures. Are there differences between those, and why? So that there are many ways in which you can compare these cases. Next one, please. And then you start building the emergent theory. Very important are the constructs. So whereas Gioia normally talks about concepts, Eisenhardt talks about constructs. These constructs are typically illustrated in a table. Maybe go to the next one now, and then we can go back to this one. Oh no, one more. Yeah, so this would be an example of a construct table. So speed of strategic decision making. So on the vertical axis, we see the cases: ZAP, Forefront, Promise, Triumph, etc. And then we see some data about that. On the right-hand side, there is a number. How many months did the decision process take? So this is a good example, I think, that of how different types of data are mixed typically in the Eisenhardt approach. Maybe you can go back now, Louisa. Yeah, so these construct tables are very important. So for Gioia, the data structure is the core, you could say, and for Eisenhardt, the construct table is the core. And now I think an important thing is that these things, don't come automatically. So what you see in the work of Eisenhardt is a kind of a mutual calibration between data and constructs, because you need to find a level of abstraction that makes it theoretical enough, but at the same time provides a good fit with your data. And an example that came to my mind, preparing for today, was a paper from 2018 by Hanna and Eisenhardt about the residential solar energy market in California, where she, based on her data, distinguishes between three types of strategies that these firms have: the bottleneck strategy, the component strategy, and the system strategy. Now, these are rather specific constructs that fit this particular industry in that particular time frame, and which are at a very different level of generalization and abstraction than, for instance, Porter's generic strategies. And so I think part of the art of doing Eisenhardt type of research is finding, the right level of abstraction of your constructs. They fit the data very closely, and they are abstract enough to allow theorizing. Okay, please go to the next one. And then, as in all theorizing, of course, it is about the why. So why is there a relationship between, for instance, having a particular strategy and leading to a particular outcome? And she says, well, there many things can help you find it. One particular source could be the explanations provided by your informants, which would also be a key factor for Gioia. But what she calls, the more detached logic of the researcher could also play a role. So you're not stuck with the explanations that the informants give you. And you can actually rise above that and say, okay, this is how they see it. But for me, with my more, let's say, theoretical background, I can also see that there might be a different, more theoretical explanation. And then you have to weave that into a coherent theoretical story. So you see there's a lot of art here in the Gioia approach, as well as in the Eisenhardt approach. It's not something that you do automatically. It's art. Okay, next one, please. We have that one. Next one. Okay, now just to reiterate the differences, and I think this is important. So in most cases, you should do either Gioia or Eisenhardt.
Venire qualche idea, perché funzione pubblica controlla gli stati in parte.
Okay, so Eisenhardt is more positivist, looking for objective reality. Gioia is an interpretive researcher that lived reality. Eisenhardt emphasis on objective facts and events. Gioia subjective perceptions and meanings. Eisenhardt is more interested in representative cases. So if she studies the solar energy market in California, she studies cases of firms that are, representing the whole gamma of firms active in that particular market, geographically and in terms of the time frame. Yeah, so in Gioia, I think there's more emphasis on also developing new concepts. Eisenhardt more on relationship between concepts that might already have been known or are specifications of concept that we already knew. So there are quite some differences between the two. Yeah, maybe the next one. Now, I'm very pragmatic in these things. And I think, you know, there's not one particular method or approach that I am, you know, locked into. I believe in horses for courses, meaning that you select whatever fits your interest and your, you know, research question or your data. If you can go to the next one, Louisa. Yeah, so typically, you know, people would say, okay, I first have a research question. This research question dictates the type of data that I need. Now, if your research question, for instance, is about what motivates managers to, you know, do a particular thing, then you would have to interview managers. If your research question would be more like, you know, what happens to companies when they make losses in 3 consecutive years, you would need financial data. And so the research question is assumed to lead to the type of data that you need, which then leads to the research method that you need. But I think, you know, you can also look at it differently. Sometimes you have access to data, interesting data. And then you start thinking, okay, what is the question that I can answer using those data? Or you have a pet method. You want to use a particular research method. Okay, fine with me. You want to use that research method. What is the question that fits that? And what are the data that fit that? And so for me, you know, you can start at any point in this triangle. Maybe go to the next one. And that's already the final one. So from that perspective, you know, you can more easily make a choice between these two main approaches that I've discussed. So for Gioia, in those cases where the informant's view is vital, when you're interested in the lived experience, yeah, that is, then you use that method. Or you are interested in articulating new concepts, take Gioia. Or, you know, you have access to interview and observational data, but not really numbers, and maybe only one case, Gioia is the man. Now, on the other hand, if you're more interested in the objective truth, if you're interested in explaining outcomes, company results, you know, why is company A successful and company B not? Eisenhardt is more the way to go. If you're interested in combining data from different sources and different types, if you have access to multiple cases, maybe the Eisenhardt method is better for you. And sometimes you can actually combine them. Sometimes you can say, okay, I objectively know, and I'll show an example in the next slide. I objectively know what happened in a number of cases, but I also want to know, you know, how that was interpreted and perceived by people in that reality. And we may have various types of data there, but of course, then you also need multiple cases. And if you can go to the next one, that is an example, again, from my own work. Sorry for that, but here, what I already mentioned, we had one single post-merger integration process, but we observed that in different parts of the organizations, something very different was going on. So some of the departments or units were fully integrated between the two companies. Others, there was just, you know, some selective displacement of tasks, something that one company wouldn't do anymore and the other would do. There were some that were, you know, hardly integrated at all. So we said, okay, these are actually 8 different cases. And to be honest, you know, it was a reviewer who at a certain moment said to us, well, you know, because we, as you see also in our, this is part of the data structure. So if you have multiple cases, why don't you use Eisenhardt? So in the end, we ended up with combining actually Eisenhardt elements and Gioia elements. So it can be done. but you must be aware of what you're doing then, because you can also antagonize some of the reviewers if you do so. So that is an example of, you know, it's not black and white. There are also shades of gray in between. Sometimes you can borrow a bit from one method and introduce it in the other, but you must be aware of what you're doing. And maybe the next slide, I think, is the final one, almost the final one. So I've just discussed these, but of course, there's much more going on in qualitative research. You know, you have process studies, which lean a little bit more to the Gioia side, although pure process researchers tend to be critical about the more cookbook nature of the Gioia approach. You have the more ethnographic studies. Eisenhardt says she does ethnographic work, but I think most ethnographers would not probably agree with her. And you have the text as data studies that you nowadays, the discourse type of studies that are blooming, and which are not easily, you know, locked into either of these two. So there's much more going on, but I've just, you know, focused on these two main representatives at this moment. And next one, please. Yeah, that's it. And we have some time for questions.
Thank you very much, Niels, for your very comprehensive presentation and also providing us with several alternatives that one can use. So let me open up the floor to questions from, please use your electronic hand, and in this way we can identify you.
Or even your physical hand.
Accepted as well. Maybe I can kick off the Q&A session until people come up with their questions. And I have seen some pre-submitted questions. So one of them would be asking to clarify a little bit or to talk about mixed methods in light of what you presented about qualitative studies, qualitative research, sorry.
Yeah, so that is a difficult issue. I think that in theory, mixed methods could be great. I have little experience. I've published one mixed methods paper, to be honest, not more than that. But it's typically something that will be very difficult to get published. Because some of the reviewers will like your quantitative part, but not your qualitative part, and vice versa. So that is difficult. Plus, there is another difficulty that probably all of us know. I mean, it's always difficult enough to keep your paper within, you know, the word count and the page count that the journals prescribe. And you know, with mixed methods, that would be even worse, because you have two findings sections, you have two methods sections. And it becomes really problematic. Having said so, sometimes it can work, but yeah, I would not advise to try it. What can work sometimes, you know, if actually reviewers ask you, do you also have some qualitative evidence, for instance? That's great. Okay, now you can put it in. Or vice versa might also happen, but do you have some, you know, quantitative material supporting your conclusions? It might happen, but more often you find that, okay, reviewers say, okay, your quantitative analysis is fine, but, you know, can you breathe some more life in it with some qualitative examples? Okay, great, if you have those, yeah.
Right, thank you. There is one question on the chat box. So when dealing with qualitative methodologies, sample sizes always comes as a limitation. So what would be your advice as to how many would be enough, taking, for example, a case study?
Yeah, so that depends very much on your question. If you have very, you know, rich data and deep access in a single case, that can be sufficient to do interesting work. for other questions, you will need to compare between cases, and then, you know, it starts obviously with 2, but then probably you have more value if you can add some additional cases. But again, you know, above 10, it becomes quite unmanageable in a truly qualitative study. And then you would probably have a QCA type of study earlier, rather than pure qualitative work. So yeah, I mean, again, horses for courses. So I believe in the strengths of a single case, if you focus on questions that can be answered by that single case. And we will always have limitations in generalizability, of course.
There's another question by Olga, which is about, well, she asks, you mentioned that coding is not suitable for the classical case studies. Can you give examples of how to analyze case studies data?
That is a good question. So if you look at the classical case studies, there typically is very little information about how the researcher came from the data to his or her conclusions. So because, you know, if you have very rich data, what stops you from just very selectively quoting from that data, you know, to draw whatever conclusion you want to come at? So that is a fundamental point, which is actually echoed in Eisenhardt's work. Eisenhardt is also quite, let's say, intransparent in the steps that she takes in the data analysis. And that is, I think, a big contrast between Eisenhardt method and the Gioia method. Gioia, step by step, you know, you show what you do. And Eisenhardt, but she says it's also difficult, if not impossible, because I have these multiple cases. You know, if I also then step by step, then it's simply, you know, it becomes a book rather than a paper. So in classical case studies, there was very little. I think in Eisenhardt's multiple case study, it's very much tied to the development of constructs. So you develop these constructs that are relevant, are important to understand those cases, and you illustrate them very thoroughly with as much material as you can. But to be honest, there are also very different ways of writing case studies, which are much more, let's say, yeah, impressionistic, if you like. So there's not one, you know, approved and generally accepted method.
Great, thank you, Niels. Another question, would you recommend mixing the classical grounded theory method with the Gioia method? For instance, study designs fit the classic grounded theory, but you can use Gioia's data structure to show how you have developed your theoretical codes.
No, well, to be honest, but this is my personal opinion. I think classical grounded theory has outlived its you know, usability. I think the Gioia method is a much more realistic and acceptable way of doing grounded theory. So you will do grounded theory, but avoiding some of the disadvantages of the Glaser and Strauss approach. So I don't see much value in going back to those prescriptions. By the way, Panos, there are also some questions in okay, in the chat, I think. I don't know to what extent they have been covered.
Well, these are the ones I have been using, but
okay. Yeah.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions that were submitted before the talk on different software packages and tools that may be recommended. So do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I don't have a lot to say there. To be honest, I worked with two different packages, Atlas TI and Max QDA. for 2 different papers, but my conclusion basically was that it didn't help me that much. So what I now do, or what I've done most of the time and still do mostly, is simply use Excel. I put these quotes, etc., in Excel, and use that to organize. And maybe it's not the most advanced and sophisticated method, but it works for me. But that is very personal. But don't expect miracles from the software. That is, I think, something, it can help you. It certainly can help you to do more efficiently this going through the data and reorganizing the data. But in the end, it will be your decisions that count. By the way, something that's can be extremely helpful, and I wish that would have existed when I was doing most of my qualitative research. That is the software you nowadays have, like ChatGPT, to transcribe interviews. That is really good. And if I just recall how much I spent in having my interviews transcribed in India and then getting them back, and having to make so many improvements, it's that this is much better now.
Faster and less costly.
Yeah.
There is one question about dealing with reviewers. So it seems to me that the reviewers will not accept an analysis that is not based on codes and preferably on the Gioia method nowadays. And the single case study case seems to out of the question. How can we convince on the contrary?
Yeah, so I'm not so pessimistic about that. So firstly, Eisenhardt and her students and people working in that tradition get their work published in Strategic Management Journal and Academy of Management Journal all the time. So apparently, but of course, what counts here is that Eisenhardt and her students get very, very good access to companies. So that is something that helps, and that we, simple mortals, sometimes, can envy her for. So I think if you have good access to data, etc., you can publish also, without any coding. And the single case, again, I see papers published on single cases that, I don't think that in itself is necessarily an impediment, but if you have really rich data, if you have a single case and your data are not, that deep and rich, then it becomes difficult. If you have multiple cases and your data are less rich, you can compensate for the lack of richness and, by making those comparisons. But if you have a single case, it really needs to be in depth, and hopefully something interesting comes out of it.
In the interest of time, I think I will ask one last question from the chat box, which is the person asks, for the first order coding in Gioia, we do it based on the literature, so somehow we already have a theory our theory beforehand. Is it still congruent with the Gioia method?
I understand the question. I think it would not be conform to the Gioia methods if that would be the end of the story. So I think that it's very important that you keep your eyes open for maybe unexpected observations. Actually, that is also what makes the research interesting. You find something that, you didn't even think about, or maybe it's contrary to your expectations, and then make the most out of it. And so what is interesting? Interesting is something that goes against, what people conventionally think or expect. So if you can find something like that, for instance, a causal relationship is the other way around from what people think. Then you probably, you have the material to write an interesting paper that has a good chance of being published. If you somehow, you have to find the nugget of gold that makes your work, interesting to read.
I'm sure we could continue endlessly the discussion. In the interest of time, we will need to draw this webinar to a close. So I would like to express our special thanks to Niels for sharing with us his expertise and wisdom. And we have all learned a lot today about qualitative research and also the different contingencies that may apply and how to deal with them. So let's give him an electronic round of applause.
Okay, thank you
And
for
thank you very much,
attending.
Luisa and Alessandro, for helping with the organization of the webinar.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Niels. Thank you, Panos. Great seminar.
And I understand that the slides will be downloadable from the EURAM website. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for attending.
Well,
Okay.
I guess I can close it.
Yeah, I think everybody is moving out.
Okay.
Maybe you can stay just a little bit.
Sure.
Maybe a question I wanted to ask you.
So should I?
Well, doesn't matter. It's no secret. So I was just thinking about this project that we do on the history of EURAM. So we must find a moment that we can think about, okay, what are some of the historical materials that you may still have at the office? So I was wondering, for instance, is there anything, you know, photos and things like that that you have from the periods when EURAM was still in the Rue d'Egmont?
Oof.
Rue d'Egmont. I've looked at the internet if there are any materials, you know, from that time, but I couldn't find anything.
I will have to ask my colleagues because evidently I wasn't there yet.
Okay, you came in later.
Yeah.
Because we had, if you look at the first meetings that we had, that was in the Rue d'Egmont.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have the minutes of all those meetings.
Yeah, the minutes, but I think, you know, it would be really nice if we could have some, you know, atmosphere. So, yeah.
The only person.
That's a thought that came up with me because Peter asked me to talk briefly about this project tomorrow in the fellows meeting. And I thought, you know, the more materials that we have to make it, to enliven it, you know, that and would be much nicer than just text.
Of course.
So
I will have a look at what there is. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's think about it. So if you maybe, you know, if you come across colleagues that they may know, okay, we had that meeting or whatever, and some pictures were taken, I don't know.
Yeah.
Nowadays, of course, there's much more material, but at that time you didn't actually make pictures that much.
No, we didn't make pictures with the phones. That's the issue.
No, that's a big difference. Yeah.
So I will see what's in the files because
Yeah,
I don't see where else I can look for it.
I don't, you know, just keep your mind open for and maybe ask some people who have been around for a long time.
Okay, good.
Okay.
And that was it?
And now someone wants in a bit late. I don't think that's much use to that.
Well, some people get the time difference wrong.
Yeah, I think so. Probably that's what's going on.
Okay, so it was
okay.
I think it worked well. This
I'm okay. I'm happy. I think it was a bit. Yeah, I mean, there was not much. There weren't many questions afterwards, but it's okay.
No. Okay.
Okay.
See you soon. Bye bye, Niels.
Bye bye.